You stand at a funeral, you wear black, you stay quiet, you leave flowers on a casket, and you say a few final words before walking away. It feels timeless. It feels like something humans have just always done. But the real answer is far stranger. For most of human history, death didn't look anything like this. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't clean. And for a shockingly long stretch of our past, it may not have involved any ritual at all. Picture a small band of early humans, maybe 40 people, moving across a dry African landscape over 100,000 years ago. One of them collapses and doesn't get back up. What happens next? For decades, researchers assumed the answer was obvious. Surely they buried the body. Surely they grieved. Surely some primitive version of a funeral took place because that's what humans do. But the evidence tells a messier story. The oldest widely accepted deliberate burial comes from Qafzeh Cave in Israel, where archaeologist Arella Hovers and her team examined a child's skeleton placed in a shallow pit, deer antlers resting near the chest. That burial dates back roughly 100,000 years. It's early, it's significant, but it's also incredibly rare. Here's the strange part. For the hundreds of thousands of years before that, and for long stretches after it, there's almost no evidence of intentional burial at all. Bodies were left where they fell, or dragged a short distance, or simply abandoned to scavengers. Why? Because survival didn't leave much room for ceremony. If you're constantly moving to find food and water, a dead body is a liability, not a memory to preserve. Predators are drawn to it. Disease can spread from it. The group has to keep moving, and the dead get left behind. This is the part most people never learn. Death, for most of human history, may have been treated less like a sacred event and more like a problem to solve quickly. And yet, something changed. Around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record starts shifting. Bodies appear curled into deliberate positions. Tools and ornaments show up beside them. Red ochre, a mineral pigment, gets sprinkled across bones in patterns that look intentional rather than accidental. Paleoanthropologist João Zilhão has spent years studying Neanderthal burial sites in places like Iberia, and his research suggests something remarkable. Neanderthals, not just modern humans, were placing their dead in shallow pits, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods nearby. If that's true, the instinct to mark death with meaning isn't unique to our species. It might be older than our species. So what flipped the switch? What turned an abandoned corpse into a body worth burying? Many researchers point to something deceptively simple: memory and identity. As human groups grew larger and more socially complex, individuals stopped being interchangeable. You weren't just a body that could hunt or gather. You were someone's daughter, someone's hunting partner, and someone whose voice and face and stories existed nowhere else in the world. Once that kind of social bond exists, a death isn't just the loss of a worker. It's the loss of a person who can never be replaced. And that loss demands a response. This is where ritual enters the picture. Not because ancient humans suddenly believed in an afterlife, although some likely did, but because grief needed somewhere to go. Psychologist and anthropologist Paul Pettit has spent decades studying Paleolithic burial practices, and his work suggests that the placement of bodies, the use of ochre, the inclusion of tools or shells weren't random. They were early forms of communication. A way for the living to say something to each other and maybe to themselves about what a single life had meant. Think about what that required. Someone had to dig. Someone had to choose which objects to place beside the body. Someone had to decide on a posture, knees pulled to chest, arms folded, facing a certain direction. None of that keeps anyone alive. None of that helps anyone hunt tomorrow. It exists purely because the group needed to process something that had no practical solution. That's the moment ritual was born. Not out of superstition first, but out of grief that had nowhere else to go. And once that behavior existed, it spread and diversified at a startling rate. By around 20,000 years ago, burial practices across different regions start looking wildly different from one another. Some cultures buried their dead with elaborate beadwork. Others cremated remains. Some left bodies exposed on platforms for birds to consume. A practice that still exists today in certain Tibetan sky burial traditions. There was never one universal human response to death. There were thousands of local answers to the same unbearable question. Here's the part that should make you pause. Anthropologist Mary Steiner, who has studied prehistoric burial patterns extensively, points out that many early graves contain signs of repeated visitation. People returned to these sites. They didn't bury and forget. They came back, sometimes adding new objects, sometimes disturbing the original burial to interact with it again. That single detail rewrites the whole story. Burial wasn't just about disposing of a body safely. It was about maintaining a relationship with someone who was no longer there. Sound familiar? It should, because you still do this. You visit graves, you keep photographs of people who have died, you talk to them sometimes, even though you know they can't hear you. None of that is new behavior. It's a 30,000-year-old habit wearing a different outfit. Now think about something stranger. The objects placed in ancient graves weren't always practical. Shell necklaces, painted antlers, tools too delicate to have ever been used. Researchers have long debated why anyone would bury something valuable instead of keeping it for the living. One leading explanation ties back to identity again. If grave goods represented the dead person's role or status, burying them wasn't a waste. It was a statement. This person mattered enough that their things left the world of the living along with them. It was, in a very real sense, an early form of memorial. Compare that to what happens today when someone dies. Headstones, memorial pages, a favorite item placed inside a casket, a locket with their photo. The instinct hasn't disappeared. It's just been repackaged for a modern world. So when did death stop being a survival problem and start being a meaningful event? The honest answer is messier than most people want to admit. It wasn't a single invention. It was a slow drift, shaped by growing social bonds, expanding memory, and a brain increasingly capable of imagining a future where someone is permanently, irreversibly absent. That capacity, the ability to imagine absence, might be the real origin of grief itself. Animals show signs of distress around death. Elephants linger near the remains of herd members. Chimpanzees sometimes carry deceased infants for days. But what seems uniquely human is the leap from feeling that loss to building something physical to represent it. A grave, a monument, a ritual with rules and meaning that others can follow. That leap changed everything downstream. Religion, philosophy, even art owes something to those first deliberate burials. The question of what happens after death, and what the living owe to the dead, didn't start in temples or scriptures. It started in shallow pits in the ground, dug by people who had no words for what they were feeling, only the instinct that something had to be done. So the next time you attend a funeral or visit a grave or simply pause at the mention of someone who has passed, you're not performing some modern social custom. You're participating in one of the oldest threads connecting you to every human who ever lived and grieved before you. You stand at a funeral, you wear black, you stay quiet. You leave flowers and say a few final words before walking away. It feels timeless because, in a very real sense, the ritual has changed 1,000 times across 1,000 cultures. But the reason behind it, the simple, aching need to mark a life that mattered, has survived everything, even death itself.